I talked last time for a bit, believe me, a short bit, about Maoist China and the Cultural Revolution, which, even if you've only had the barest thumbnail sketch, you should realize was a bad, bad time. Especially if you were any kind of artist. There was not really any room to do anything, and for the most part, if you were an intellectual or an artist, and you weren't right in line with the party, you could be killed, or at least eliminated from your post and sent far, far away. The poetry of Mang Ke is both beautiful and interesting because of what it does with this era. Now, Mang Ke was writing during Maoist China, but of course he was not publishing anything during this time because there was nowhere to publish it. The first time we see his poetry in any kind of circulation is after Mao has died and after the Cultural Revolution is over. Now, if you've read any of the pieces that I have put online for you so far, you will probably recognize that they don't read a lot like Du Fu, and you have probably read them and thought to yourself some version of, what is this talking about, right? Now, contemporary critics thought the same way, right? And we're going to get into why that was so important. Now, after Mao died, as you might imagine, things loosened up a little bit. I talked about Deng Xiaoping and how a lot of the moderate elements in the Communist Party were looking around going, look, this place is falling apart. We have to kind of focus on actually opening things up and making some money. And as things opened up, the arts opened up too. A lot of it had already been happening, as I mentioned, but they became a lot freer and more experimental. Now, poetry led the charge, which, if you've read a lot of poetry, you might be forgiven for wondering, why poetry? If you were going to have a kind of artistic rebellion, wouldn't something like painting or novels, something that everyone really gets, be a lot better choice? But in this case, the reason poetry, or one of the main reasons poetry became the leader of the avant-garde, the leader of the art forms that were trying to change things, was partly because it was the easiest to circulate. If you want everyone to read a novel, you have to have access to a really nice printing press or some kind of mimeograph machine. At that point, it would have been mimeograph machines. And if you don't, no one's going to be able to read it. How are you going to pass around several hundred pages, right? Poetry, on the other hand, is quite easy. In 3 or 4 pages, you can have 20 or 30 poems. If they're short, 5 different people can contribute. You can even put images in there if you want. So at this point, you have what critics at the time called the misty school of poetry. They called it misty because the poems just seemed so intentionally misleading or obscure. If you've read any of the poems in our collection today by Mang Ke, you could probably agree a little bit that it doesn't read. You don't pick up a poem by Mang Ke or any of the people who wrote with him and go, oh, I see, it's writing about that, right? Even Du Fu, one of the great masters of Chinese poetry, has a level of access that most people can get. I mentioned last time that kids in elementary school read his poems, right? No one in elementary school is reading Mang Ke or his contemporary Bei Dao. They opened the landmark journal Today, or Jintian in Chinese, with the idea of taking back from the government the free play of the reader's mind. Now, this is crucial for understanding why so much of this poetry feels intentionally obscure. To a certain extent, it was. The poetry coming out of the Cultural Revolution, actually all of Maoist China in general, was designed to be so straightforward and so, for lack of a better word, prosaic, that anyone, anywhere, knew exactly what it was talking about. But by doing so, all readers were effectively meant to have the same experience. Mang Ke and Bei Dao, and many of the poets who wrote with them, wanted a form of independence from that. We want to have our own thoughts. We want to read a line of poetry and not be forced to all think the same thing as everyone else. Now, it's a very subtle form of rebellion because they were not yet ready to storm the capital, take everything back, and have unlimited free speech because no one had that kind of power, right? So, what if we just carved out for ourselves the psychological equivalent of free speech? We can think and feel whatever we want, But the only way to do that is to write in such a way that the meaning isn't 100% clear. Now, here's an example of a poem written during Maoist China that I would say the vast majority of sort of Maoist era party poems are this way. So I'll read the English. From this time on, China is shining bright. From this time on, the eastern parts of the world are shining bright. Today, China is a China hung with lanterns and streamers. The world is a world pounding drums of exultation. This is the result of thousands of years. This is the result of hundreds of years. This is the result of the Chinese people's, the result of the world's people's struggle. This is the result of Marx's, Engels, Lenin's, Stalin's, and Mao Zedong's thought. From today in Chinese history, it is Mao Zedong who writes. In world history, it is Mao Zedong who writes. Not a lot of flexibility or, you're not going to have a problem understanding this poem, right? Now, here's what's fun about this. I had to really dig to find this poem. You would think China being a quote-unquote communist state, that it would be super easy to find this kind of propaganda poetry. It's hard. You really have to dig online. Why? Well, because it's crap. I mean, let's face it. It's pretty much crap. When I was studying for a master's degree at Mang Ke University in 2009 to 2012, there was actually a class called the 17 Years of Poetry. It was meant to be about the period from 1949, which is when the Communist Party, of course, won the Civil War and effectively started running the country, to 1966, which is the beginning of the Cultural Revolution. Well, first of all, no one wanted to take the class. And second of all, the course was basically designed to tell people just how bad this poetry was, right? No one reads it, even today. Now, by contrast, let's look at a poem by Mang Ke's that obviously wasn't from exactly this era, but he was writing stuff like this during the time when propaganda poetry was being written. So take a look at it. Pallbearers drift by like a cloud. The river slowly carries the sun, dyeing the water's long surface golden yellow. Such stillness, such vastness, such sadness, a meadow of wilted flowers. Now, what is this poem about? What is it saying? Right? The short answer is it could be a lot of things, right? But there's a couple of interesting things going on here. One, the imagery is actually quite simple. We have rivers, we have water, we have meadows and flowers, we have clouds. The difference being that they're being used in such a way that does not make the meaning basically clear, right? Particularly important is the last line, right? So we have clouds, the river slowly carrying the sun, the water's long surface yellow. You can have an image in your mind of a sort of a riverside scene. And then all of a sudden at the end, wham, a meadow of wilted flowers, which is a very disturbing image in itself. I mean, imagine you were walking along a river and you looked up and there was an entire meadow of wilted flowers. It would be very peculiar and possibly disturbing. Also, nothing before this line suggests we're going to see a meadow of wilted flowers. Now, the kind of people who are reading this poetry look at this poetry and go, seriously, this is not only intentionally obscure, but it's a problem. This is why Mang Ke and his friend and compatriot Beidao, those were their pen names. They were not their real names because they were afraid to write under their real names. You would wonder, why would a poem, first of all, who would care if someone wrote a poem like this during the era when this was the big deal? Well, the difference is that the ideal of poetry under Chairman Mao had to be clear. The people in Mao's estimation were clear. Not boring or simple, but clear. So the poetry that was being written was meant to point the reader back to the three principal representatives of socialism under Mao: the industrial laborer, the farmer, and the soldier. Anyone not doing that clearly was trying to hide something and probably foment some kind of rebellion. But poetry like this also requires you to engage it in a very different way. This, you can just read it, blow it off, move on. This one, you really can't. Now, I'm going to draw another quick parallel here to the poem we've studied in some depth already, Spring Scene. I'm not going to read it again because we've already read it in some depth. But what I would like to point out is that in this poem, and in fact really in all of Du Fu's poems, the things of nature behave like things of nature are supposed to. Okay, mountains and rivers remain, the city enters spring, grass and trees have grown thick. For the most part, nature is a place of solidity and safety and stability. Here the country is broken, but nature is still nature. Even when Du Fu takes a few liberties with nature, like flowers shed tears, and as of course we talked about before, there's different ways to read that, where in fact maybe the flowers aren't shedding tears. But what makes it sad is that flowers are reliable. They're beautiful. It's an image that everyone can understand and relate to, right? Now, let's read a similar poem by Mang Ke that talks about nature. Actually, there's two little passages. The first is simply called Labor. And this is the entire poem. Like all horse carts, I will pull the sun closer to the wheat field. Okay. Now, first of all, the sun on the wheat field is how much more basic can you get, right? Farmers plowing and using their horses. It's simple. Except that in this case, the horse cart is the thing pulling the sun. That's not obviously what happens. And there's a lot of things we could say about that. I'm not going to spend the entire time unpacking it. What I would like to point out is that this is not the way this image is supposed to work. It is not the horse cart that pulls the sun. It's the horse cart that rolls under the sun. And in fact, that's probably what Du Fu would have said. Okay, because here grass and trees are growing. The city enters spring. It's very reliable and simple. Here, it's not. And there's a poem called Wilderness. I'm wounded all over, lying in the north at dawn, feeling nothing but golden rivers like the wounds on my body, bleeding non-stop, a silent flow. How I wish these flowers and light, plus my name and my eyes, could be carved into a steel. How I wish to see tomorrow or some point in the future the people who will come here for cultivation or else to mourn me. Now, as with many poems of this school, there's different ways to read this, but imagine for a moment that you are the wilderness itself. And in this case, the cultivation of the land, the thing that requires the horse cart from above, and which in most Chinese poetry is a symbol of beauty, of stability, here is ghastly, feeling nothing but golden rivers, bleeding non-stop, wounded. The land that is being cultivated is not rich farmland. It's something that's been gashed and destroyed. The people who will come here for cultivation or else to mourn me. The speaker isn't even going to say what people might come to see, right? Perhaps they're coming to cultivate, perhaps mourn him. It almost seems like it doesn't matter. And he talks about how he wishes, or how I wish, could be he or she, or any other gender here. These flowers and light, plus my name and my eyes, could be carved into a stele. Now, a stele, or stele, is a kind of funeral, or not really even a funeral stone, but it's basically a memorial stone, right? Into which you would carve a poem honoring someone or simply historical note. They're meant to last a long time, right? But it's effectively a stone, a piece of nature that someone has carved something into. Now, the wilderness is meant to be an image of nature that is untamed, pure, right? Even when turned into farmland, there's an element of it that's still productive and beautiful. Here, nothing about it is productive and beautiful, and perhaps ironically, the wilderness is asking to be remembered in a form that has nothing to do with it. How I wish someone out there would take what I was, flowers and light, my name and my eyes, take those things and just carve them down into a rock, since no one's going to remember me anyway. So nature is impermanent, it's unstable, and it's bitter. This is not the nature of Du Fu. This is not the nature of other poems as well. Now, this is key to Mang Ke's style. One of the things that he does frequently is to take very, very simple images and turn them inside out in some way. As you read his poetry, try to focus in on this. If you read about a sunflower or you read about a cloud, look for what he's doing with it, because he's not necessarily going to deploy it the way you would imagine. I hope you can try to enjoy some of this poetry on its own terms. It can be very hard to take a step back from what we are used to reading. News items, Facebook posts, Twitter feeds, things like that, to a kind of writing that seems intended to confuse us, because we are used to having information given to us simply so we can understand and respond. This is not the same thing, obviously. It's meant to push you. It was written to push readers in that era. It was meant to say, yes, you are being given things clearly all the time, but that does not mean that you are thinking. It does not mean you're creating. It simply means you're absorbing. So try to read the poems in that spirit. You are not meant to understand a specific thing. You're not meant to read Sunflower in the Sun and go, oh, I see, it's about this. Okay, let's move on. Because if you could say that, you would simply dismiss the poem and not really go back to it. A good poem is something you go back to many times. Your goal in this unit is simply appreciation. It's not perfect understanding. You are meant simply to come away with some new ideas, some new experiences that you can trace back to a poem. You're not meant to nail it down. So, one of the things I will mention, though, in parting, is that Du Fu's discussion of the An Lushan rebellion in his poems was relatively, not straightforward, but you could easily trace the events, right? Mang Ke's is not. This is partly because you couldn't write a poem accusing the chairman of murdering millions of people, because then you really would go to prison. They'd find you and they'd take care of you, right? The other thing is that the goal was a little different, right? Du Fu was not trying to become some sort of pure poet. He had rules. There were things he wanted. He wanted to be a civil servant. He didn't want to be some romantic poet. Mang Ke and the others had been exposed to quite a few years of very different modern poetry, and wanted for Chinese readers something that they had not had before, which is a new space. So what was as important as rebelling against a cultural revolution style of writing was carving out a space that was totally new. This was the goal, not simply to chronicle what happened or even the spirit of what happened, but to look forward, to look beyond what had been done to something new. So try to keep that in mind as well as you read.